Wright objected to the idea of dividing the space of a house into separate cubicles and permanent rooms. He loved classical Japanese tea house and farmhouse architecture in which space is altogether more permeable and fluid, not walled off but divided by sliding screens. And out of this idea he developed the open plan, which lies at the heart of so much modernist architecture. And it's there very early in his work, as here.
Wright's genius as a planner is the channel through which the lessons of Japan flowed into the American mainstream. The massive stone fireplace recalls the social anchorage of the Japanese hearth. The detailing is very sophisticated, but it's not ornamental. It fuses with the design idea that he summed up in the term organic architecture, the belief that space, material and furniture should compose an organic whole, not just be a collection of things in a box.
My mother was a teacher and she wanted an architect for a son. I happened to be the son, and of course, naturally an architect. I was conditioned by her. The room into which I was born was hung with the wood engravings of the English cathedrals made by Timothy Cole. So I was born into architecture.
Wright began as a draftsman in Louis Sullivan's office in Chicago and inherited his mantle. He had the longest career of any American architect, and he still casts the longest shadow. No designer was ever more aware of the interrelatedness of nature's systems or strove harder to embody them in his work. He was also capable, as geniuses sometimes are, of astonishing arrogance. Nowhere is this clearer than in his design for the Guggenheim Museum in New York. As a pure building, as creation of space, the Guggenheim is one of the great inventions of the 20th century, with that spiral ramp that draws you slowly up towards the light flooding from the shallow dome. But its contents, the paintings and sculpture, have to fight the slope of the floor, jammed into the angled bays. It's Wright's gesture of indifference to arts he thought were inferior to his own.
The house that fully shows the lyric relation between culture and nature that Frank Lloyd Wright sought is in the woods of Pennsylvania. It doesn't announce itself suddenly, all in one piece, like a mansion in a park. You catch glimpses of it through the trees, like the partial views that you get of a Japanese tea house in its garden. Your expectation rises, and then bingo, the whole thing with those magnificent cantilevered terraces jutting out above the rocks and a cascading stream. It's called Fallingwater, and Wright designed it in 1936 for a Pittsburgh department store heir called Edgar Kaufman. For me, without exaggeration, this is the most beautiful American house since Jefferson's Monticello, and it becomes so by its play between nature and culture, with those great forms seeming to hover above the elements of nature and yet rooted in them.
The noise of the water made it a trying house to live in, but that needn't worry the visitor. It's a wonderful set of variations on themes, the liquid water surface and the hard skin of glass, the cut fieldstone masonry and the raw rock ledges, the sense that the bulk of the building is cradled in that rock, while at the same time the balconies fly out into the air, working against gravity. All the opposites held in a poetic synthesis. Artists, too, believed that nature could underwrite their work even as it pushed towards abstraction. If European pioneers of abstract art like Kandinsky believed that, why not Americans?
In the 19th century, American artists had equated nature with spirit, with creation itself. They saw it as the ground of American uniqueness. An impulse like that doesn't just suddenly evaporate, and so, in the early 20th century, The avant-garde was rich in images of land, sea, sky, plants, earth and moon, as nature and abstraction converged.
One especially lyrical talent in the early American avant-garde, part of Stieglitz's circle, was Arthur Dove, who for some years lived on a boat in Long Island. His early abstractions still reflect the world. In this one, from about 1912, Sails, you can see the triangular mainsails against the cloud and landscape shapes behind. Like some European avant-gardists, Dove wondered if shape and colour could also convey an impression of sound, if there could be a match between painting and music. And in this grey seascape called foghorns, the soft blooms of shape do suggest the echo of those horns in the mist. For some American modernists, Long Island wasn't far enough away. Some American modernists went west, looking for primitive America, in search of nature stripped bare. They found it 2,000 miles away in New Mexico, around Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and especially Taos. Taos had been an art colony for years before any modernists got there. Since 1900, minor academic artists like Ernest Blumenschein had gone there to paint the Pueblo Indians, the adobe churches, and the landscape. By 1915, organised tourism had turned the place into a sort of internal American Tahiti with its own art marketing organisation. But the artist who came to dominate our idea of New Mexico imagery was a woman, Georgia O'Keeffe. Some of her earliest abstractions from the 19-teens are very beautiful. Their response to landscape is luminous, almost pantheistic. Once in New Mexico, she reacted intensely to the images of its culture, like the crosses erected by the penitentes, stark against the big sky. Her close-ups of flowers were very popular, both for their lushness and for their sexual overtones, whose presence O'Keeffe indignantly denied. Her paintings of skulls and pelvises in the landscape mostly verge on kitsch surrealism.
Georgia O'Keeffe died in 1986, just 2 years short of her 100th birthday. And this was her house and studio in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Was she one of the greatest American artists? Well, there's certainly many people who think so. I'm not so sure, but this is confused by the fact that for the last 50 years of her life, she was unquestionably the most famous woman artist that America has ever produced. She was a diva of independence, an icon of feminism, and God help anybody who had the temerity to suggest that there might have been, let's say, some unevenness in her work.
I can imagine myself being a much better painter and nobody paying any attention to me at all. But it happens that the things that I have done, the things that I've been doing have been in touch with my time so that people have liked it.
Georgia had to be moved emotionally by something in nature in order to paint it. But she let that first feeling rest inside of her for a year. And then we'd go back to the same place. And she might just sit and look at it a while, and then we'd go back 6 months later and she'd go to work on it. She could not stay in New York. 6 months there was all she could take. And then she would come out here and go to work, and work 11 hours a day was not unusual. Then there was the hiatus of taking a walk, which was sort of a rebuilding of this thing of the spirit. She wanted to work. That was the whole point of Georgia. She wanted to work.
O'Keeffe had shown her work at Stieglitz's gallery since 1916. They became lovers and later married, and Stieglitz photographed her incessantly, both clothed and nude. Their relationship was a scandal at first, then it became a legend, and finally a middle-brow soap opera like The Loves of Bloomsbury. "We have talked over everything," Stieglitz wrote. "Into 1 week we have compressed years. I don't think there is anything to equal it." Stieglitz disliked going west of the Hudson, but O'Keeffe moved to New Mexico in 1929.